to memory lane with you. Take me back to hours of fun with you.
It's time for the Pop Culture Classics Podcast, a celebration of the all-time favorites and the people who brought them to life on TV, film, stage, theme parks, and recordings.
We take off our hats to you, so let's bring on the show.
We're glad you've joined us. And now your host for Pop Culture Classics, Greg Ehrbar.
Thank you, Kenny Woods. Welcome to Pop Culture Classics. I'm Greg Ehrbar, also the host of the Funtastic World of Hanna-Barbera, where we also welcomed our guest, BRIAN LEVANT, for his work on the Flintstones features and the Scooby-Doo movies, and talked about Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera. So please listen to that if you haven't. This is a sequel of sorts. He made a special appointment so he could talk about one of the other of his many accomplishments working on Happy Days. And he, with Fred Fox Jr., has written a book called Happy Days, A Visual History of an American Television Classic. Truer than true, righter than right. Thank you for being with us again, BRIAN LEVANT.
Oh, that is my pleasure. We always have a good time speaking with one another here.
You know what I'd like to do, because you are a television, especially sitcom, not only child of the era, but a student of the era. Mentioning in our other podcast that Honeymooners was an influence on your writing, and as should be most television writers, no matter what era they're writing in. But also, you brought back successfully and with the spirit of Leave It to Beaver, with Still the Beaver and the new Leave It to Beaver. And I would imagine that you were very familiar with many of the classic domestic sitcoms of the 40s and 50s, because I'd go back to Blondie even for that, the 28 movies. You knew those, I'm sure you loved them, and what you did and what Garry Marshall did and the writers with Happy Days is it had the flavor and the warmth and the coziness of the tradition of those shows, but it had a 70s feel to it, a little bit more you could do story-wise. But what were some of your faves? I know Leave It to Beaver was, because that was the crown.
Well, yes. No, Leave It to Beaver was my favorite TV show. And one of the first things I did when I landed here in the spring of 1975, fresh from graduating college, was to make a list of projects. And at the very top of it, I just wrote Still the Beaver. And after like 6 years of trying, finally got it to be a movie of the week on CBS. Extremely successful. CBS did not want to continue. A young executive at Universal named Ned Nall, who was working in the fledgling cable industry, contacted me, and he said, I think we can sell this to the Disney Channel. And we did, and we became a monstrous hit there before it became in a conflict between Disney and Universal over theme parks in Florida, and we were lost. And thankfully, Ted Turner, an incredibly interesting American, rescued with a then record, I believe it was 78 episode commitment to keep the series going for many years. Leave It to Beaver was part of an ABC lineup that included My Three Sons, Ozzie and Harriet, The Donna Reed Show with Paul Peterson and Shelley Fabre, and they excelled in this quality family entertainment. And that was the spirit that was discussed in early 1971 in the Newark airport. A conversation between Tom Miller, who was head of development at Paramount, and Michael Eisner, who then was, before it came to Paramount, was an executive at ABC. They talked about the shows that ABC no longer made. And they also had an affection for Mama, which was so early I never saw it, and it was never syndicated. The television adaptation of I Remember Mama, George Stevens, a film about a Norwegian family coming to America in the 30s. They thought they could do that in the 50s, the generation that they came. They approached Garry Marshall, who was then doing, I think, the beginning of The Odd Couple, and had come from work at Desilu, a long stint with his partner Jerry Belson on the Dick Van Dyke Show, and the following season began to sell their own shows as well, none of which stuck until The Odd Couple. And Garry was always very hungry. So they came to Garry with this idea, and as he said in one of his biographies, they were talking about guys named Lars and Nels. I don't know guys named Lars and Nels. So he made it about people he knew, situated them in Milwaukee, which was the hometown of Tom Miller. And so they proceeded to create New Family in Town was the original title. It's centered on the middle child of a middle American family in the middle of the 20th century. And it was a throwback. The pilot was very good. It starred Ron Howard and Marion Ross and Anson Williams, but not Tom Bosley, Aaron Moran, or Henry Winkler, or John Most, or Ted McGinley, Kathy Silver. It goes on and on. And it failed. It was played off on the last episode of Love American Style to get their money back, and it sat on the shelf at Paramount until American Graffiti was such a monstrous hit. And when Garry Marshall heard they wanted to do something like Graffiti, he called them, "You already made that show with the kid who's in the movie." And they were given a second chance. And in that second chance, Happy Days was created. And when they tested it, they didn't have the theme song. So they put in Rock Around the Clock. Nick Abdo dropped that in. And by the time they got to 9 o'clock, the dials were all the way turned up in the preview house. And it was a huge success. And they got a commitment. I believe that was like late February. And so they started production like almost instantly, shooting 17 episodes. The show was warm. It was a single camera show, very different from what we knew. Very sweet, innocent show. A lot of Richie and his friends facing the hurdles people do in growing up. Henry Winkler was cast as Fonzie, a late addition to the cast. ABC at first asked for a motorcycle gang. Then Garry Marshall, always thinking about budget, said, "Can it be one guy?" And of course, they wouldn't even let him wear a leather jacket. Garry fought them on this, saying that people wore leather jackets to protect themselves. And so that's how Fonzie got his leather jacket. But in the pilot, he doesn't talk for 23 minutes. Mm-hmm. The show did well. They were number 17 their first season, and they got picked up for 13 more. What happened was they ran into a buzzsaw named Jimmy J.J. Walker on Good Times, who wrote his dynamite catchphrase. And the shows literally exchanged places in the ratings, with Happy Days tumbling into the high 40s and Good Times like launched into the top 10. The show is on the chopping block. And Garry Marshall, who was also, I think it was going on the Odd Couple's last season, and his other show, The Little People, or the Brian Keith Show, was going. And he used the same trick he'd used to save The Odd Couple a few years before. The Odd Couple was a single camera show, shot like a movie. He turned it into a 3-camera show, like the Dick Van Dyke Show, in front of an audience. And it propelled both leads into Emmy wins for their performances. So they wanted to try this with Happy Days with a big change, moving Arthur Fonzarelli much closer to the spotlight because his character was breaking through. William S. Bickley, the original producer of the series, who did the first 2 years, did a magnificent job of taking Henry Winkler's character, a loner, and knowing how the public wanted to see him slowly evolve into becoming someone, and slowly made him a part of the Cunningham family. And it was this clash of cultures and this growing affection between him and these people that really drove the show. Sometimes it could be outrageous, jumping the shark and crazy stuff, which I never liked. I'll give you, this is so funny. My mother always used to say, "Watch out, a show's on the decline." She knew what jumping the shark was before jumping the shark. A show was in decline when they went to California.
Oh, wow. That's Laverne and Curly.
Yeah, my first episode on Happy Days was they go to Hollywood. And Fonzie jumped the shark. This is my first year on staff, season 5. And I said to Bob Brunner, our producer, I said, is this a good idea for the show? And he looked at me sternly and said, this is what Garry wants. And who knew it would become the most famous episode? Maybe not for the best reasons. But for me, Happy Days was an incredible experience. I was in the Writers Guild, but I had virtually no experience. And they were very patient and nurturing with me there and gave me incredible opportunities, things I never thought about. So years later, it's like I asked to come to screenings. And once in a while, I'd give a note. Garry and Jerry, they only really saw the show like on Monday afternoon during lunch. So it was the only time they could see a cut. So they were always in a hurry and needed to do other things. And so they kind of edited like Civil War doctors. Just cut off the leg. We'll start the scene here. Garry used to do crazy things. Once on Laverne and Shirley, he put a wild line, an extra line of dialogue over a lamp. And one time they didn't have a shot. He said, well, just cut to black and the audience will think it was their TV. But I tried to impose a little bit more finesse in the editing. And they started, I was 23, 24, and I would be asked to go to screenings. I never appreciated how that might have sat with my cohorts in the writer's room. Tremendous affection for the show. I was a kid from the Midwest who grew up not too far from the world of the mid-50s. When I was a kid, there were still drive-ins on the highway and some hoods and leather jackets. The last vestiges of them were still visible. To work at the very top of the industry, to learn at the feet of Garry Marshall and Jerry Paris, to not only be a writer and eventually a producer on the show, but the level of interpersonal relationships was very different from anything else I've ever worked on. We all kind of had children at the same time in the early 80s. And when we weren't playing softball, either in the league or on the road visiting major league stadiums and doing USO tours in Europe and Okinawa, there were birthday parties for the kids, for everybody. And you were always together. And people use the term TV families kind of loosely. But the fact is that for 11 years on an audience show where you're all together every day for so much of the year, so long every day, and depend on each other so much, it is a family. And Happy Days was exemplary in that respect.
I was with Disney for 30 years, and when I worked in the creative department, the advertising creatives, we got to be like that,
Yeah.
It grew to 100 people, but at the time it was about 30, and it really was esprit de corps. We went out of town more than I went with my family. We did these brainstorms. We worked late hours. My question is, I still have dreams, or I'm back in the brainstorms, back working with coworkers, going to places, working on commercials and stuff, and they're fond dreams. Do you still have dreams like that?
Over the years, my dreams of the safe spot in my life has grown from elementary school to overnight camp to Happy Days. And I haven't had a Happy Days dream in a long time, but the last one I had was, I was stunned to find that the show was still in production. And I think this was still when Tom Bosley was still alive and Al Molinaro and Garry. And it was great to be back. Working on the book was like that in many ways. Fred and I, we spent, months and months working on Happy Days every day, talking to everybody, sharing pictures. It was totally unique. And I was very fortunate to have that with another TV family, with the Cleavers. I inserted myself into there, and it took a while to earn their trust because they were a group who had long felt that everyone else who was in their position of having a TV show that was made in the 50s was still on the air, an elite group. You got Gleason and the Honeymooners, you got Lucy, you got the Twilight Zone, and you got Beaver. Now, if you can name 3 more off the top of your head that were still running in the 80s and 90s, good luck. And unlike those shows, they were the hired help. They had no ownership They had always fought Universal tooth and nail for every dime of merchandising and whatever residuals and worldwide things that they were entitled to. But all that aside, again, I took everything that I learned on Happy Days and tried to apply it to the way the show was written and what I learned about creating an organization from Garry Marshall, from Jerry Paris, and working with people like Bob Brunner and William S. Bickley and Michael Warren. Great leaders, not just talented people, but people who knew, the term showrunner. I watched a show the other night. I think I counted 16 executive producer cards. I don't know who's in charge. In the old days, if you got the executive, you were the boss. And today, I think there's really only two people who I think of off the top of my head, Mindy Kaling and Chuck Lorre, who are really, dedicated creators and showrunners of that stripe. So it's sad the way things have changed. Television's changed a lot. But the good thing is that there is still room in the spectrum for Beaver. Unfortunately, the new Leave It to Beaver, I believe the master tapes, we were the first Universal show that wasn't required to have a negative because we pioneered new production techniques, which was shooting on film, transferring to video, doing our post. We were the first show to edit digitally. We're the first show to work on computers, actually.
I remember in the 80s, I was with a production company, and that was the new world. You were going to take film, transfer it to tape, do effects in tape, color correct in tape. Worse, put credits on tape. And now, being able to digitize and HD these shows, you have to go back to the negatives, but you also have to redo the credits.
That's right.
And so it's why we aren't seeing as many of those things. Mark Evanier with Garfield, to get those digital, he had to go back and research all the credits because they had to be reinserted. So that is a huge problem, but it is a shame that a great show like New Leave It to Beaver that ran so long, that has such legs to be on MeTV and on video, it's just sitting there.
Well, I believe the Beaver tapes were destroyed in the last fire.
Oh, and then there's the fire.
They weren't in the salt mine with everything else in Utah.
And watch what happens, like Jackie Gleason's lost episodes. They'll magically appear. But the other thing is, and I wanted to ask you this specifically, is you can only get 1 through 6 seasons of Happy Days.
Right.
First of all, why were the other seasons not released? And 2 is, I don't think you can even stream them or see them anywhere.
No.
Why is that?
No, I believe they did not secure worldwide rights to music in perpetuity, is what I've been told. I don't know if it's true. It may just be, hey, 120 episodes is enough for home video. And indeed, when we were writing the book, I was surprised to see that both the DVDs for season 1 and the whole set of seasons 1 through 6 were both still in the Amazon top 100 DVD sales. It was good for us who was, hey, we're going to sell a lot of books.
Yeah. It is, in effect, still current. I would imagine it is somewhere on all these many streaming services that are wise enough to repurpose library material like that. I don't know if MeTV shows it now, but they
do. Actually, I think they show one on Tuesday nights, which is nice.
How perfect is that? You know, one of the things that was very prescient of all the people who brought this show on, from Eisner and Miller to Garry Marshall and everybody since, is that 2 things. One is that TV needs counter-programming. That's why the Waltons and Little House on the Prairie were so successful.
Yeah.
You had great Norman Lear shows. You had a ton of cop shows. But there is an audience out there that wants something else. That's the first thing. And Phil Rosenthal had a lot of difficulty selling Everybody Loves Raymond. But he said, let's do a show that's like a traditional show, but has more modern humor that we can get away with now, and also has an A story instead of the ABCD that Seinfeld brought. And look how successful he was, and they kept saying, no, we won't touch that. Same with Happy Days.
It's cyclical. I think that what's been lost in the transition to single camera comedy, as opposed to the audience, is the excitement that it brings, but also there's a reason they did it. It's cheaper. And I see that there's a trend with Netflix to groom people like Leanne Morgan and to put them in their own series. And that one, for instance, is an audience show. I ran into Kristen Johnson, who plays Leanne's sister in the show, and she said that they had just completed their second season and she thought it was very, very funny. And once again, that is Chuck Lorre at the helm of that. But if this is successful, I see a trend where they will take comedians, build them up through specials, and put them in series, and they'll learn. It's more inexpensive, and these people work best in the milieu, which is with an audience.
And a true audience. One of the Desi Arnaz's dictums was, and you can tell on Mothers-in-Law more than any of his other shows, I want the real laughter, whether it's big or small. He didn't believe in sweetening. If everybody's roaring at everything, you know, a 3-year-old knows.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to work with the guy who laughed all the shows. And once in a while, I'd say, maybe you can give that one a bigger laugh. He'd look at me and go, really?
Well, there was the famous, wasn't it James Brooks who did that? Ha, ha, ha,
Jim Brooks.
Yeah.
Ha, 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 ha. Richard Deacon, who you just mentioned, the Mothers-in-Law, replaced Roger C. Carmel in the second season, and was also Mel Cooley on the Dick Van Dyke Show, and Fred Rutherford on Leave It to Beaver, and was my next door neighbor.
Wow.
And sadly, I was actually writing his entrance into the first season of Still the Beavers Thanksgiving show. And I look out my window. I was up a little bit elevated, and he was just below me. And I see an ambulance. I go, I wonder what that is. And they were carrying him out.
You know, he was one of the pioneers of microwave oven cooking.
Yeah, yes. I have a picture he gave me of himself that was used in his microwave cooking book.
And back then it was like, don't sit too close to the TV. Don't stand near the microwave. You know, it'll give you rays and you'll turn it.
Yeah, it'll make you sterile. That may be true.
Who knows what this stuff has done to us? But anyway, you said you came in the 4th season.
My first episode was for season 4. I was very, very fortunate that like the first 6 meetings I ever took in Hollywood were successful. After a couple of months, I sold a piece to the National Lampoon. I sold a story to the Danny Thomas show, The Practice, which they never shot. There was a change of management there. When the guy who created Arthur, who was the showrunner, left to do movies, I don't know what happened there. Then I sold a story to the Jeffersons, and Happy Days was then playing weekdays on ABC, which allowed me to study it. And I said, if there's a show, you know, like I pitched to All in the Family and stuff, but they looked at me and they thought, well, this guy should be parking my car. I crashed Garry Marshall's Saturday morning basketball game, and I guarded him, and I did my damnedest and blocked a couple of his shots and had an unlikely good shooting day for me. And afterwards, he waddles up. He always had bad knees. And he goes, so what do you do? And I said, I'm trying to be a comedy writer. I'm already in the guild. And he thinks for a second. He said to call his assistant on Monday and get a story meeting. And I sold them the first one I pitched. The line was, there's a new sheriff in town, and he's cleaning up the town and throwing out all the hoods, including Fonzie.
I remember.
And
Ed Peck.
Ed Peck, exactly. They already had Officer Kirk. They loved him, a little broad for my taste. Now, they elevated him to sheriff, and the show was very successful. And the next year, they invited me back to pitch. Again, I sold them the first story I pitched, based on a true story from college of getting stuck overnight in the women's dorm when they still had things like visiting hours. And when I turned in the script, they invited me to join the staff, and I would be there on and off for the next 7 years, and really grew up there. And a crazy thing happened. During the 6th season of Happy Days, Bob Brunner and Arthur Silver, who was producing Laverne and Shirley, Gary Nardino, then president of television, you produce a number 1 show, you produce a number 2. You guys have worked together. I can sell you to the networks. And indeed, he took them out, and they came out with commitments for a Animal House ripoff, which the writers did not pan out. And they asked me and another young writer on the lot, Ron Levitt, we'd wave to each other at the commissary a couple of times, didn't know each other. And we did a total rewrite on it. And much to our surprise, it got shot. It sold. It debuted after the Super Bowl. And after 18 episodes of the sixth season of Happy Days, I left with Bob Brunner, and we went and did this show, which lasted mercifully only 13 episodes.
That was Brothers and Sisters, right?
Oh, you're good.
Oh,
yes.
And with Chris Lemon.
Yes.
We actually thought that show was pretty good for, because everything was an Animal House ripoff. That was
right. We were the best of the 3 Animal House ripoffs. I don't know what distinction that is. And we also had William Wyndham, who was a wonderful actor, and who I loved on the James Thurber-based show. What was it? My World and Welcome to It.
Yeah, My World and Welcome to It.
Yeah.
With the animation by Patty Freeling. What a show.
Yeah. And so after that, I bounced around doing various jobs for Paramount and was settling into doing some development. And Garry Marshall asked me to join a sinking spaceship, Mork and Mindy. During the 5th season of Happy Days, Gary's 8-year-old son, Scott, had an idea. Gary walked into the office and goes, "Scotty had an idea. Let's put a spaceman on Happy Days." And when everybody smiles, he walks out. What is he talking about? Once again, it's what Gary wants. And again, I was proven so wrong because after several actors walked off, a desperate search turned up Robin Williams, who was unleashed in the role, and the Happy Days cast. Any other group of veteran TV would have said, "Get this ass off the stage. He doesn't follow the script. I can't get a word in." The Happy Days cast recognized the originality. They recognized what he was, and they literally ceded the stage to him. I have never seen Jerry Paris so enthused, so inspired, and helping Robin to shape his performance, how generous Henry and Ron were with him. And we walked out of that first run through hours after Robin had arrived on the set. And everybody goes, "Spinoff." And indeed they did. And so by the 3rd season, they were sinking. ABC, I'll say this nicely, they had executives there who wanted to make themselves look good by making Mork look bad. People who went around, setting fires and walking around with a bucket of water to put it out and say, "Look what I did."
How well I know. I once told an executive, "We're not broke, don't fix it." And she looked at me with eyes that could kill.
Yeah, well, when Gary stepped back from the show, the network had stepped in. They replaced the family with more demographically suitable friends and things, and it was taking the show away from its strengths. And I was brought in to kind of help nudge it back into shape because the network had just eaten their next 5 scripts, and it would be a terrible scramble for the year. I think I helped a lot, and I was rewarded by giving control of the show for the 4th and final season, in order to rebuild the audience that had been hurt during it was at the 2nd season, they moved them up up against All in the Family, which was still very strong, and trounced them. And they, tail between their legs, went back to Thursday night and started losing ground to Magnum PI. Anyways, by the 4th season, here was the plan. Jonathan Winters, who guest starred the year before, would return as their son, who Mork would deliver as an egg, which would grow and hatch him. There would be a nationwide contest to name him, and Mork and Mindy would be married and honeymoon on Ork. And so it was fun to do all those things and to work with Jonathan Winters. Him and Robin were so wonderful. And in between scenes, Robin and Jonathan would play for the audience. And over the course of 22 episodes, they developed a real tight act. And why I never said, "Hey, we have microphones on booms, swing it over there, keep the tape running," and we would have had the best-selling double comedy album of all time. But I didn't think of it, and nobody else on the show, Gary, Paramount, nobody thought of it. And it's a shame because they were dynamite. They were better off the stage than on. But it was great experience. And the sad part of it was when you're trying to be a writer, it takes years to develop the discipline to sit there and hammer things out word by word. And working with Robin to write for Robin, you almost had to try and think like Robin. It kind of eroded some of the discipline that I'd spent so long to institute. But, it was an irreplaceable experience. And then I went back to Happy Days, and Fred and I guided the show for its final 2 seasons. It was great to be home and back with the family. And with Beaver, the idea wasn't to have another close television family. That wasn't the goal, but that's what happened. And I do feel a little bit of guilt these days. I think because we were successful and things in the past had not been successful, like Ozzy's Girls and Make Room for Granddaddy. But in any case, now the new Malcolm in the Middle, the new Fuller House, and all the Brady Brides. None of this would have happened had I not meddled with the timeline.
What's funny is that, and this is true of Norman Lear and a lot of visionaries that innovate on television, they do it so well, and all of the elements fall together because of great writing, great acting. But it does, unfortunately, create a Frankenstein that other shows imitate, but only the aspects of the show that were not as great.
Right.
I don't want to give specific examples, except I will give one specific example, and that is Mad Men, one of the greatest shows in history, that is the textbook of here's what advertising has done to us. But it also had the soapy kind of relationship things, which were inherent in that era and to those folks.
Yeah.
But when they did Pan Am, and I think it was the Playboy Club, they only took the salacious.
Yeah.
But what made Mad Men so great is look at what advertising turned us into. It was all there in front of us. And those errors and stuff. But you unleash inferior follow-ups,
Well, at least they tried. The Playboy Club was probably an interesting idea, actually.
It's not that these are people set out. And sometimes, and this is where I go with Hanna-Barbera, sometimes it is not really always them. They're the ones, like creatives, who do the rubber hitting the road, and so they take the hits. But a lot of times their hands get tied, and they're told, you got to have this, you got to have that.
You got to have a dog and Scooby-Doo.
Yeah. You got to have a dog. Yeah. But here's a couple of other questions. And this is covered so beautifully in the book because it breaks every season down as here's where we went this way, here's where we went that way. There's one season that's like we went way off the rails. We had to save it kind of after. That was not your season. The 2 things that stood out was, well, several things. The evolution of Fonzie. And Fonzie had to grow up and grow into society. That was in the workings from season 1, where he went to school and the bird did it on his notes and stuff.
Right.
But some people feel like, oh my goodness, he's not Fonzie anymore. Well, Fred Flintstone from 1960 to 1966, he changed because the audience changed and he did grow. Archie Bunker evolved. A lot of characters do that because that's what people do.
You evolve. He was a grease monkey. And he ended up as a teacher. Maybe we went too far. Maybe. He owned half of Arnold. He owned the garage, Yes. He adopted a little boy in the last episode.
That's also TV, and I'm spelling it Teevee.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing was, and this is extraordinary, in the wake of Fonzie Mania, not only did Henry Winkler keep his head, which is really hard to do, and it speaks well of his character, but nobody close to him in the cast or anything had anything but love for him even through that. It was everything around them. No one resented him. No one got jealous of him. And any problems, including what you talk about Ron Howard, had nothing to do with Henry Winkler.
No. Sometimes they could be mad at the character. Marion once in a while would say that Fonzie was sucking all the air out of the show. But they were a lovely group of people. And I think that Ron and Henry's friendship was almost immediate. And I don't think that Ron had, even though his own parents were actors, I don't believe he had much contact with someone who was so close to method, someone who was really, a child of the theater, his whole Yale drama school and Shakespeare in the Park. And so he didn't get that with Don Knotts and Andy Griffith. You know? And I think that Ron recognized that he was an artist. And I think that Ron had those ambitions and learned from Henry, as he learned from everybody. If you read his book, The Boys and stuff, you just see how the work ethic evolved and how the dreams evolved into reality. You know, I can't say enough about him. And I think the temperament of the show during and after the show is all responsible to Ron, and that he set the standards, that there wasn't to be, you know, bitching about this or that, and people weren't going to slack off, and people are going to be there on time and do their jobs and be considerate to one another. In the book, we talked to him about this, and he kind of denied it. And then at the same time, he said, well, you know, I remember one time Henry hit the script. And I said, Henry, that isn't going to do any good. The writers are trying. He set the standards. When the show went from single camera to in front of an audience, he was terrified.
Yeah.
He had never been in front of an audience except, you know, doing his Gary, Indiana song at a couple state fairs with Don Knotts and Andy Griffith. You know, Anson Williams said he found him in the corner just shaking. And then he got on stage, and as Henry said, it was like a fish to water. He handled it beautifully, and he found it exhilarating to work in front of an audience. And I think that's what made the transition so much more palatable. He loved getting those big laughs. And it taught him, it instructed him about a bigger humor, which he then took and applied to his first few films, especially Night Shift and Splash. You know, those are big joke, hard comedy movies. And once again, he didn't learn that one on Mayberry RFD, you know.
He spoke at my daughter's USC commencement, and it was very inspiring. And again, he's very self-effacing, but the fact is, he was funny on Happy Days. He was a great straight man, and he set up a lot of jokes. But when he got the chance, you know, you mentioned the camel drivers from Tunisia. I love that episode. You know what? One of my favorite lines he ever said, and I don't know if you wrote this or not, but he says to Aaron Moran, he says to Joni, there is nothing wrong with Burton Fitch. And I don't know why it was funny, but my sister and I quoted it.
I think that was my episode. I think it was Joni's Sweet 16.
So an actor who can punch a line with all kinds of humor, even when it's just, there's nothing wrong with it.
There's nothing there. That's right.
You know, and the fact that he had this ambition his whole life, and his issues with Happy Days had nothing to do with anything except that he dreamed of this, and he really took a chance.
Yeah.
To do this. People just assume a success starts as a success, but you have to keep reinventing yourself, and he did.
An incredible man with a vision of his career, and here he is, 53 years since Happy Days, and Ron has made, I think it's now, you count the documentaries, he's closing in on Hitchcock's number of films.
Okay, and then let's just dance through a little bit of the other cast. You put Marion Ross in the Scooby-Doo.
Marion actually played Mrs. C in an episode of Beaver as well. Any excuse I have to visit with Marion. She was so wonderful to me at the beginning of my career. Once after a run through one of my first scripts, I'm walking off the stage, she taps me on the shoulder. You wrote this? And I go, yeah, well, everybody pitches in, but yeah, I wrote it. And she goes, you are very talented. And being low man on the totem pole on a very successful show, that's the kind of thing that really gets you out of bed in the morning. And she's always been, once again, everybody on the show was so kind, helpful, teamwork. That was the ethos there, whether on the baseball field, in the lunchroom. By the way, Paramount in those days was brimming with shows and talent. I think they had 13 comedies on. Garry Marshall at one point had 4 out of the top 5 shows in television with Angie, Laverne and Shirley, Mork and Mindy, and Happy Days. I think Three's Company or 60 Minutes snuck in there somewhere. But you had James L. Brooks with Taxi, Tony Danza used to play on the Happy Days softball team. You look at the cast of Taxi, and they would say, "Oh, what's Tony going to do when the show ends?" Ha ha ha! You know. And Cheers, which begat Frasier. And you had Family Ties, Gary David Goldberg and Michael J. Fox and that crew. Sherwood Schwartz was still on the lot. Gene Roddenberry was still on the lot. And Marion and Tom, by the time I got there, they were very loving with each other, very affectionate. It didn't start that way. We were surprised when Marion told us stories about how in the first season, Tom didn't like it when she touched him and was very difficult to work with. But you said eventually we became family.
And Anson Williams from the very beginning.
Yeah, and don't forget that Anson was instrumental in helping launch Ron as a director.
Right.
He put together Skyward, the acclaimed NBC movie of the week that was the prestigious General Electric Theater presentation and starred Bette Davis, who Ron said they butted heads some, but at the end she gave him a book on William Wyler, who she'd done a lot of work with, and thought that he could be another William Wyler. And I think he's probably surpassed that.
I remember when it was either in one of her books or on a talk show, she said something about, "I'm starting to get used to working with Mr. Howard, but that Potsy fellow. And then I didn't realize that Ralph was an added character just because Don Most so impressed everyone.
Yes. You know, Don, like Cindy Williams and Henry Winkler, started on a Jim Brooks show, Room 222. And yes, he told us the story. He was auditioning for Potsy, and he's got a drive on at the studio. He's going to makeup. They're putting him in a leather jacket and blue jeans and everything. And he said, I was on top of the world till he walked into the soundstage and saw 15 other guys in blue jeans and Letterman's jackets. And he went like last to audition. He thought it was over and goodbye. And he said it loosened him up. So he really gave a good showing for himself. And Michael Eisner took a liking to him and said, make him a character. And he was there for the first 7 years. He left when Ron left. It's not like he was tired. He just didn't think, especially with Ron gone, that there was much room for his character to grow. Mm-hmm. And, he wanted to do other things and just be Ralph Malph, funster, because he was very different than that. Donnie lived right near me for a long time out here in the sticks. Now he's in Colorado, where one of their kids are. And his wife, Donnie's another guy who met his wife. She was cast in a 1-week part on Happy Days and turned it into a 50-year marriage here.
And he's also, even though he only sang on My Funny Valentine in that one episode, he's also an accomplished singer.
Yes, and recorded in the 70s, as Anson did. But, Gary kind of was committed to, he had one singer. He didn't think you could break two. Seriously, this is the way he thinks.
Now, am I the only person? I hope not, because this is on Spotify, so someone else must be streaming this. Am I the only person who really likes the Laverne and Shirley Sing album?
I have never heard it. I never worked on Laverne and Shirley. I was terrified of Penny and Cindy. Like every 13 weeks, they would march in another poor soul to run the show, and they'd come out with their heads on a stick, and it scared me to the point Penny used to work with the writers. We shot on Friday, they shot on Tuesday. So whenever they'd have their table, she'd sit in with the writers, and to go to the bathroom, rather than walk the close way past the open door of the writer's room with Penny sitting there, I'd go the long way around to avoid it. That's how scared I was of Laverne and Shirley. All right, so Penny also played on the Happy Days softball team on occasion. Fred Fox and I were also the managers of the team. And I left her to Fred's care. But we were playing in Albuquerque, a charity game that her first husband sponsored. He was the head of the Special Olympics there. And I was the first one down, waiting for the bus in uniform, and down comes Penny. And I've never talked to her. I mean, hi, Penny, we've never really talked. I'm Brian Levant. I run the show with Fred, and, we manage the team. And I went to the University of New Mexico too. So did she. And she looks at me and goes, so, and kept walking. So I was right. But in later years, we had a mutual friend. And I guess when I started directing movies and had some success, she might have recognized the name. So, oh, say hi to Brian. What?
There are certain shows like Laverne and Shirley, and I won't mention other ones, where the cast or the star was miserable or the set was on fire all the time. You never saw it at home, and they're still great shows, and it's unfortunate that they couldn't enjoy it as much as us.
I think, as time passed, the ladies resolved their differences, which really stemmed from Cindy never thought there was anybody in her corner. Garry was the executive producer. His father was a producer. His sister was a producer. His sister was the star. And Cindy had Fred Fox for 13 weeks. They went to high school together. And then he went to Happy Days.
The Jump the Shark website, which I think is no longer, they may have invented the phrase. I think they trademarked it. But they also had the Ted McGinley Award for the person who joined the show, and then it suddenly went off. It was like your mom's theory and my brother's theory. If they start wearing costumes too often, then there's my
on my shows, I should have been canceled right away. I love costumes. But I learned that from Happy Days. Nothing I like better than in the early show. Tom Bowser Howard comes home with this giant silver screw hat. And I brought it back years later. But Garry always liked the funny hat. I give him a funny hat.
I would imagine the Ted McGinley Award was not a thing at the time.
No, I'll tell you something about Ted. I always liked Ted. Lowell Gans always picked on Ted because he was really raw when he started. Ted told us a story once in the middle of a scene that Jerry Paris is crawling on the floor, pulling his pants leg to get him into a two-shot with somebody. Ted learned, and I think Ted McGinley, I think he's now surpassed Gavin MacLeod as a person in the most episodes of television. And my daughter was at a Paley Center event with the cast of Shrinking, and they all praised Ted and his professionalism and how he never misses. And I look at that as he's a smart guy. He learned, and he really took everything he learned on Happy Days and brought it to all those different shows that he's done over the years. And I watched on Shrinking, I watched a very minor character. I knew as his role expanded that the reason was that the writers started to love him because he always delivered. He spent 7 years on Married with Children, which was created by Ron Levitt, who I had written The Brothers and Sisters with. He's just been great wherever he's gone. And this is the legacy of Happy Days. How many people, Scott Baio, what is he, 60 now? He's been in the public eye since he was 12. I directed a couple of Charles in Charges, one of his shows that he did after Happy Days. And to prepare for that, I watch run-throughs. They were at Universal, and I watched Scott Baio direct. And Scott Baio directed just like Jerry Paris. As I do. I mean, you talk about the long-running effects of Happy Days. Is that everybody from Happy Days, when they're directing, and there are so many, almost everybody on the cast, I think, and so many writers turned into directors. And they all have variations on Jerry Paris and Garry. And it's an energy. You don't just sit in your seat and watch a monitor. You get up in there and you're a tumulter. You're trying to infuse everything with energy and bring every scene to a boil. So I've observed so many of my friends from the show. And that is the ongoing influence, and that we pass it on to people who we work with. Then we're really all the comedy descendants of your show of shows, and what Carl Reiner learned there that he brought to the Van Dyke Show, that Garry Marshall and Jerry Belson brought to The Odd Couple and beyond, and taught Lowell Gans. It just kept rolling.
Isn't it sort of a common thread there? You got Carl Reiner, who made a lot of stars and behind the scenes people because he nurtured, and you had Garry Marshall, who, look at the careers of people like Anne Hathaway, how she also had Julie Andrews giving her advice. Look at how, from what I read in Garry Marshall's book, having Richard Gere snap shut the little case with the jewelry in it, he brought out the personality of Julia Roberts. How many people like that? And then the vast amount of, like you said, industry giants that came out of what Garry Marshall did.
In the book, we put together a short list just of the sheer number of series that were created or produced by Happy Days alumni and the staggering number of movies. And shows you wouldn't think of. Mary Hartman, Moesha, running the entire gamut of the last 30 years of comedy. Everything kind of grew out of it. And you look at Rob Reiner, remember, wrote the second pilot of Happy Days. He was then Gary's brother-in-law, and he and his partner, Phil Mishkin. And Rob played on the softball team, too, a lot. Big bat. Well, a big guy, actually. But when you look at the combined Ron Howard, Rob Reiner, Garry Marshall, you could just stop there, throw Lowell Gans, me, Rich Carell in there, and that's like the entire output of every studio for a year. And we ended the series with Tom Bosley giving a lovely speech about his family. And Lowell Gans wrote most of this speech. And when he finished dictating it at the Thursday night table, he was so overcome with emotion, he just got up and walked out. But he wrote and Tom delivered and just turned to the camera and said, "Thank you for being part of our family," and lifted a glass to Happy Days. Then we played a montage of short clips from the 11 seasons of the series to the tune of Elvis Presley's Memories. That's how we got out of that one.
I remember it well. I remember it being discussed, especially Tom Bosley's moment. You probably know this, and you probably have heard this a lot, but do you ever stop and think yourself, you've been part of so many milestones and cornerstones of television and film. What a body of work you've had.
Thank you. No, I sometimes I say to myself how stupid I was. I was never motivated by money. I could have done a lot more, but the things that I did do were because I really cared about them. It's hard to describe that being 5 years old and watching the premiere of Leave It to Beaver and seeing somebody who you recognized is so many of your own faults and weaknesses and inadequacies 50 years later that I spoke at 4 of the cast members' funerals. How could you ever consider being so involved in people's lives when you're in kindergarten? When I was walking out the door for, I think, my 3rd date with my wife, and my mom stops me and says, "Wait, there's a new show coming on that I think you would like. It's from Garry Marshall, from the Van Dyke Show. It takes place in the 50s. And sat me down to watch the pilot for Happy Days. And how do you know that 3.5 years later, that I would be writing for them? It's just hard to reckon. The Flintstones, how it became such a huge part of my life. And to go from watching the first episode in 1960 to having the pinball machine utilized all these designs that I helped to create. It's an awkward, odd, and tremendously satisfying journey. And I'm lucky that things that failed, like Jingle All the Way, have become embedded in the audience's consciousness, and they love it today. Who would have thought? So it's been a really interesting and rewarding journey. And I thank Happy Days for giving me the opportunity to learn my craft and to practice it. And for them to be I was a wild man. I couldn't sit still. I had to pitch crazily day and night, worked furiously, so invested in it. They nurtured me. They calmed me down. They taught me how to think. And Howard Storm, who just passed away at 94, a good run, who directed most of Mork and Mindy, a lot of Laverne and Shirley, a lot of my early stuff, was the same way. They had a comedian's heart. They lived to inject energy and enthusiasm into the process. That, I think, is the thing that's kind of set my work apart, too. Seriously. And it comes from watching them and watching what they did and how they made the mundane fun and interesting.
You know, you mentioned money, and I often quote Penny Marshall. I think she was telling this to Merv at some point. And I'm not great at doing the impression, but I love to. You think that if you have all the money you need, that all your problems are going to go away, but they don't. That's kind of the thing. You want to pay the bills, you want to have all that stuff, but what really brings you joy is being able to bring joy to others. And it's cornball as can be, but what you and your cohorts have done over the years is bring joy and laughter through comedy mostly, which we so desperately need. So I thank you, and I thank all the people you worked with who I don't know and some I can never know. I thank you all. I thank you all, as Merv used. But I thank you, as Dorothy said to the Scarecrow, I thank you most of all for taking all this time, for working with Fred Fox Jr. on this extraordinary book. It's very readable, very conversational, but has tons of information. Folks, if you love television and you love the show, and how can you not, please get this. It makes a lovely gift.
A new low price on Amazon.
And it's got that nice hardcover without the dust jacket, so you don't have to worry about that getting ripped at all, you know. That's nice, too. So thank you again for being on yet another show with me and all of our listeners. Thank you, Brian Levant.
Oh, no, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Really great.
And it's been a pleasure to know that those of you listening are listening. As always, thank you extremely much. And until next time, bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed the Pop Culture Classics podcast with Greg Ehrpar. Please join us again, and thanks for listening.